Welcome to the Politics and Media Show with me, John Rees. The murder of Stephen Lawrence in 1993 shocked Britain. He was killed by a group of white youths at a bus stop in southeast London in 1993, but only now have his killers been brought to justice. Last week, 2 men were convicted of the murder at the Old Bailey in a trial that's reopened the debate on racism in the UK, both within society and in the police. Before I introduce today's guest, let's take a quick look at the murder of Stephen Lawrence and its significance for politics in the UK.
He was one of those children that every parent would be proud of. We were waiting for a 122 bus or a 161 to come. We were interrupted by a group of white boys on the opposite side of the road who shouted out, what nigger? I wished we both had run for our life, but only I had run. Stephen had stuck in his position and was attacked by the group of white boys, stabbed and died.
18 years after the racist attack in which teenager Stephen Lawrence was murdered, 2 of the men involved, Gary Dobson and David Norris, were given life sentences. But it's taken 2 public inquiries, a police inquiry, the Macpherson report, and moreover, almost 2 decades of tireless campaigning on the part of Stephen's parents to get to this stage. The main accusations of failure in the quest for justice for Stephen were directed at the police. Soon after the murder, police received letters naming 4 out of the 5 men who were to become the main suspects, but they failed to make any arrests in the first 2 weeks following the murder. Stephen's mother, Doreen, even handed a list of suspects to one detective, only to see him screw it up into a ball in front of her. In all, it was a catastrophic failure by the police, who would soon be deemed as institutionally racist.
They didn't seem to want to engage with us. They seemed to be too concerned with myself, Stephen's background, where we were in a gang, and all things which were irrelevant to the things that happened that night.
Lawyers and police left Doreen and husband Neville Lawrence to launch their own private lawsuit after deciding there wasn't enough evidence to prosecute anyone. But that soon collapsed and the 3 defendants walked free. The Lawrences had to wait another 4 years to see the suspects brought before a judicial inquiry ordered by the government. The inquiry unearthed damning reports of the police's conduct in the case and eventually led to the removal of the double jeopardy law. And so after 18 years of an exhausting and stressful campaign in which the Lawrences divorced, some sort of justice has been achieved. But is it enough? What lessons have been learned? And following the recent UK riots, which saw police and ethnic minority community relations at an all-time low, is it naive to say that institutional racism is a thing of the past?
With me in the studio to discuss this is Paul Anderson-Walsh, who's the Managing Director of the Stephen Lawrence Charitable Trust, an organisation set up to support young people from diverse and disadvantaged backgrounds and help them fulfil their potential. Welcome to the show. Also, we're joined by Bevan Powell of the National Black Police Association. He chairs the Met's Black Police Association and was part of the association's team on the Lawrence inquiry in 1998. Welcome to the show. Paul, there's an old phrase that justice delayed is justice denied, and I think Justice Treacy in the case said that we have a measure of justice in the result last week. You must be pleased about it, but do you feel the same way?
I do. I think that I think pleased is right, but I think any pleasure, any elation is very mooted, and it's mooted for the very reason that you're hinting at, which is that there are 5 or potentially 6 men who were involved in this joint enterprise of murdering Stephen Lawrence, and only 2 of those people have come before the courts. So I think there is a real sense of relief. I think there is an opportunity for the Lawrence family to finally exhale, but I don't think that gives us an opportunity to recuse ourselves.
Bevan, the judge, Justice Treacy, called the detective back into the stand, didn't he, and said, look, 2 people have been sentenced here, but there's more work to do. That's quite an unusual kind of direction from the judge, isn't it?
Yes, but I mean, it's quite right. There's still a lot more work to be done. And, the first thing I'd like to say is that the sentencing last week, really what we should remember is we reached that point because of Doreen and Neville and the fact that they had the tenacity, the courage to tackle the police, the broader criminal justice system, to say, look, we want justice for our son. And it's taken 18 years to get to this point. So I think, society owes the Lawrence family a huge debt of gratitude to bring about a social consciousness which looked at the way in which not just the police and the criminal justice system, but broader public sector looked at the way in which they delivered services to black and ethnic minority communities. But obviously the spotlight was on the Met in terms of the failed investigation back in '93 and the way in which they let the family down.
And do you think, what do you think about the issue of the sentence itself? Because there's been some controversy over the length of the sentences that the people convicted were given, the fact that they were pinned back because of their age when they committed the crime. So there's a peculiar kind of disjunction going on there, isn't there? That there's 18 years later that you've got people who are clearly adults before you, and yet the tariff is limited by the age they were when they committed the crime. There's going to be a debate about that, isn't there?
Obviously there'll be a debate, but the judge had to operate within the framework of the law. So unfortunately, from my point of view, I think he did the best he could have done. Because my concern was that perhaps the sentencing might have been even more lenient. So I certainly welcomed the sentencing that was passed, but I think that the framework within which the judge was operating obviously was challenging.
What do you think about that? Because there's going to be some review of that, isn't there? Where would you stand? What would you say to a review that was looking at that process of sentencing?
Well, I think it's interesting because I think it gives you an opportunity to kind of spread this conversation a little bit wider as well, because the judge was clear that he was constrained by Parliament, and I think that the use of the word constrained, I think, was a very well-advised word, and I think that came with a lot of power to it. Because literally he was constrained. That gives rise to the question of, well, was the sentence appropriate? Was it inappropriate? Well, I think the answer to that is that what the Lawrence family have said is that they wanted justice. They never said they wanted revenge. They've never sought retribution. They seek justice. Now, if justice dictates that the sentence is to be attributed, the tariff is to be given out to them as they were juveniles at the time of the crime, if that is the definition of justice in our system, fine, that's the definition of justice. So no one's got any problem with that. The judge then said, well, hold on, there are some aggravating circumstances, and named 3, about they've lied in court, they were entirely unreliable, there's no contrition, and so on and so forth, and the sheer heinous nature. I mean, I think they talked about they've been swallowed up, I think was the expression. Now, so from the Lawrence family's perspective, Doreen Lawrence was clear. The judge's hands were tied, but she was grateful. My view would be that we want justice, not revenge. Now, if the nation says such and so egregious and so heinous is this as a particular crime, which indeed it is, that we want the Attorney General to relook at that, and the Attorney General then comes back and says, well, do you know what? This is such a special case, we're going to change that, then that will be justice too. So we're our only interest is justice.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point that those calls didn't come from the Lawrence family themselves. But to go back to the point that Bevan raised earlier, what do you think the impact of this will be now on the question that was raised by the Macpherson inquiry about institutional racism, not only in the police but in the broader society? Do you think we've got to a turning point, or do you think not?
I think it's been interesting to read these Sundays. We've been kind of basking in the glory of this over the last week or so, and one of the things that's worried me is I've been very nervous about this kind of cut flower syndrome. We have this great, bouquet of euphoria that we've got this verdict and everybody's delighted by it. But is it an opportunity? Is it the moment? Is it the right moment for backslapping? Well, when a young man is walking along the street in Salford and someone comes up to him and shoots him at point-blank range for no other crime than the fact that he's of a different colour, we're not out of the woods, are we? When we watch the English Premiership and we're mired in the kind of racial controversies, or a young black man breaks down in tears during an FA Cup match, we're not out of the woods. And I think there's two serious issues that we've got to couple and really confront the brutal truth around. One is the issue of, and this is what the Lawrence case is about, of course, because Stephen's a metaphor for exactly what I'm going to say. There's the issue of institutional racism and the issue of individual racism. Now, the thing that is interesting to me is that if you fast forward 18 years and you look at where we are today, quite apart from the fact you have to reckon that Stephen's parents have fought for justice for longer than Stephen lived. You know, that's breathtaking even on its own. But the question then you come to is you say to yourself, well, given that situation, where are we now with that? Well, where we are is that the difference between, and I think this is the cause of the outrage, why people are writing to the Attorney General is because the difference between the individual acts of racism as embodied in Norris and Dobson and the institutional racism as evidenced by the Metropolitan Police Force is that one of those has shown contrition. And the one that's shown contrition is the Metropolitan Police Force. Now, are they there? Are they able to recuse themselves? Not for a moment. I don't think even they would say that. But I think what we can say is we've seen that they do at least accept that there's something that needs to be fixed. And I think that needs to be welcomed. And I think, therefore, we should be recognising the fact that this is a glass that's half full as opposed to a glass that's half empty. And let's at least applaud the fact that from an institutional point of view, there's a recognition that we need to change. And I think why that is because we can disown individual acts of racism and we can look around and say, oh, that's outrageous, that's got nothing to do with me. But our institutions have everything to do with me, and our institutions represent us, our police force, our government.
Well, let me bring Bevan in on that, because
sure.
I mean that's an interesting point, because I mean it's hard to go along with the kind of some of the mainstream media coverage, which has almost got the tone, well, that was then, this is now, we've all got past this. I mean that's, you know, I mean Paul was saying that's hard to swallow, but do you think there's a distinction that Paul's making between the progress that's been made in the institutions, in the police and other places, and of the views of individuals?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, when Paul says that the glass is half full, I agree with that. That the Met has made some major inroads. There's still an awful long way to go. And I think there's still the sensitivities around the use of the language itself, institutional racism. And, you know, Jack Straw and others, you know, came back and said it wasn't a useful term. The then Commissioner, Paul Stevenson, said it wasn't a useful term. And I think some of the issues there was that there was a confusion between overt racism and the collective failure, the definition as in the Stephen Lawrence inquiry report that talked about the collective failure, the unwitting, the policies and the practices. And so for me, I think it's about revisiting that, ensure that everybody understands the language. Because I think what the Met and the police service across the country have been able to do is to regulate behaviour. So I'd be extremely surprised if I heard someone being called the N-word or the P-word today, and if that did happen, whoever did that, their job would be on the line. Okay, so I think we've come to the point where you can be fairly comfortable that it would be a rare act to hear somebody called a derogatory name because of their ethnicity. But I think when we look at our policies and our practices as defined in the inquiry report, there is still disproportionality. And if we look at Section 95 data that comes out of the Criminal Justice Act, it's quite clear then, presented in those government statistics, that there is a differential in outcome dependent on ethnicity.
Yes, I was going to ask you about that, because I mean this is all very well, but when you look at the stop and search figures, and this applies I think to the Muslim community as well as the Afro-Caribbean community in here, they'd say, you know, come on, and we saw a lot of television interview with young people around the time of the riots saying, you know, and by the way, you wouldn't think from the mainstream coverage that we'd had riots, which in part were about the killing of a black man in Tottenham. So it's not it's not quite as much progress as perhaps we might think.
I think there has been progress in terms of the re-engineering of sort of like the way that homicides are looked at, the critical incident training for senior managers, senior officers across the country, the introduction of independent advisor groups. So that, I think we have to acknowledge that has taken place. I think the difficulty now...
Just let me ask you, I'd like to be sort of specific about what we're saying. What you're saying is that where there is a potentially racist assault or murder, that the police's procedures in these cases are improved, but statistically about the sort of general attitudes towards the population, as the stop and search figures show, perhaps not so much. Is that a fair summary of the point you're trying to make, or not?
Yeah, I think the processes have improved, particularly around homicide, so the way in which evidence is secured, etc. So that's a given. But it's the way, where we have discretionary powers, and when we look in terms of progression within the organisation of black and ethnic minority staff, when we look at some of the criminal justice outcomes, stop and search is one element of that. That's where we have to start looking, well, why is there a difference here? What is it that's going on? And I think this is where more of the sensitivity comes in, because very often you get to the point where there's a bit of defensiveness when we try to push the barriers and we say, well, look, race seems to have come off the agenda. And I think it's quite right that we separate the two things, that there's the progress that needs to be made, further progress needs to be made in terms of the institution. We need to separate that from the investigation of Stephen and the sentencing, because that's almost the inquiry, the legacy in terms of pushing forward the whole agenda around institutional racism. The issues around getting the other suspects, I think, is separate to a lot of these other issues that we're talking about.
Can I come in on it?
Yes.
Because I think I'm sympathetic to Bevan's position, and I think that what I would say to you is that it seems to me that I understand why government folks don't like the expression institutional racism, but it's hardly the politically correct version of saying the N-word. It's an uncomfortable expression, but truth is uncomfortable sometimes. So let's own that. But I think the point is that where we are 18 years on is that I can legislate for what comes out of your mouth.
Absolutely.
But what I can't do is legislate for what's in your heart. So I can stop you saying things about me, but I haven't really solved the problem unless I change the way you think about me. And the perception piece is not you can't legislate that. You have to. That's an educational piece. That's an attitude piece. And I think that from my point of view, I feel though this whole thing rests on the question of attitude, and I think that the problem is the solution. The problem is attitude, and so the way you resolve this, it feels to me, and I don't think this is a kind of flat packed, get it home, put it up in 30 minutes kind of thing. I think the way you solve this is you say, look, what makes the Lawrence case interesting, as you'll hear in every report, is that Stephen was just a good kid, and he is the metaphor for individual and institutional racism, as I said. But his mother, particularly, is the metaphor for all that's good and all that's right about, wait for it, being British. Integrity, decency, fairness, grace under fire, and all the rest of those things that we as a nation hold up and say, yeah, these are our values, this is what we're about as a nation. Now, she embodies that, and she's a black woman. Now, what's interesting is, it seems to me that if attitudes cause the problem, then attitudes can fix them. And so our way of going forward, in conjunction with the pursuit of the criminal justice piece, is by being able to bring out into the professions, into the media, into law, and so on and so forth, the group we call the Stephens, whose very attitude has the effect of modifying the attitudes of people whose perceptions about black and Asian and ethnic people is warped. And one final thing, if I may, and that is that I think the other thing that we mustn't forget is that whilst things may have improved, and I use that with a lowercase I and in inverted commas, for the Afro-Caribbean community, the question of racism has not necessarily gone away, it's just been relocated, Because if I now talk to a Muslim, for example, or if I look at the issues of Islamophobia and so on, then that which was being visited me, which Scarman wanted to deal with, and that which was impacting me, which Macpherson wanted to talk about, is now being visited on the Muslim community for no other reason than they're Muslim. So it has. I think we've got to be very careful about grandstanding. I think there's no room for complacency. I think it's important that we acknowledge progress, but I think we also have to recognise that it's the end of the beginning, not the beginning of the end.
Okay, well, thank you both. That brings us to the end of the first part of our discussion, but as you can see, there's still plenty more for us to talk about, and we'll be doing exactly that in the second half of the programme.